You're listening to Rethinking Trade with Lori Wallach.
Small business owners and farmers are protesting the Korean WTO and NAFTA are transnational forms of autocratic governance that subordinate our
in North American free trade agreement.
Seattle has never seen anything like it.
Mexican workers face threats of violence.
Trade policy has delivered one punch in the gut after another.
Welcome back to Rethinking Trade, where we don't just talk about trade policy, we fight to change it. I'm Ryan, and I'm joined once again by our in-house trade expert, Lori Wallach. Lori, last week during one of our regular Global Trade Watch meetings, you talked with us about some complex but fairly important details regarding medicine patents, copyrights, and international trade rules that impact vaccines and other medicines. This was in the context of the campaigning that we're currently doing, supporting a call from over 100 nations at the World Trade Organization for a temporary emergency waiver to the WTO's TRIPS rules, which would increase global production of COVID-19 vaccines and treatments. So today I wanted to ask you to basically give that talk again, only this time to our listeners. So if you're with me, let's take a deep dive into the world of pharmaceutical technology patents and copyrights.
The mission here is to get vaccines, treatments, and tests to people in every country of the world. Because no one is going to be safe. The economy is not going to get back on its feet anywhere unless people are able to fight COVID everywhere. Right now, there is the capacity to make about 4 billion doses of vaccine per year. 15 billion doses are needed. Governments have spent tens of billions of dollars giving it to pharmaceutical corporations to come up with vaccines. Yet the pharmaceutical corporations have monopoly control over where, how much, if the vaccines will be manufactured, where they can be sold, and at what price. And one part of the reason for this lunatic situation where dozens of countries have not had a single dose of vaccine, and many developing countries are not expected to have significant vaccination until 2024, is in part because of World Trade Organization rules in the trade-related aspects of intellectual property, TRIPS agreement. These WTO rules require every signatory country to give very lengthy monopoly rights to corporations with respect to not just patents over, say, a medicine, but the copyright that goes to the computer program for the machine that makes the vaccine or that makes the ventilator work, and the design information about the machine that is used to do a key process in making the vaccine, and the what's called undisclosed information protections, which has both to do with some of the know-how about what needs to be done to make it work, but also has to do with certain test information. And all of those protections are what South Africa and India, now with 100 countries supporting them, are asking is temporarily waived so that those monopolies are suspended to the extent doing so is necessary to treat and to stop the COVID pandemic. And the campaign that's going on around the world is to get governments to support this because the WTO works by consensus. And so far, the U.S. has been one of the very few countries, along with the UK, with Canada, and the EU as a bloc, that have been stopping this very important emergency change at the WTO. And these TRIPS rules basically before have led to needless suffering and death because these extreme monopoly protections are the reason millions of people in Africa died in the 90s from AIDS. When in the US, HIV diagnosis was the beginning of a chronic disease. You took antiretrovirals, you had medical interventions that meant you could live a long life. And the US pharmaceutical companies wouldn't share that information. The countries in which these medicines were made fought what was then an effort to get these WTO rules suspended. And the result was millions of people died. Now, in this circumstance, not only are millions of people going to die, but if we don't get this right, it's actually against our own national interest. Because if there is an outbreak of COVID any place where mutations can occur, that is going to generate the variant that gets around the vaccines we've already had, that puts us all back into quarantine, that is more deadly, that is more infectious. So really, really, for any of us to be safe, we all need to get the vaccines, the tests, and the treatments.
There's a few key terms and ideas, and you talked about some of them just then, Lori, but maybe if you wanted to expand on a few of those, it might help me and the listeners understand sort of the depth of what TRIPS covers. When we think of medicine copyrights or a medicine patent, you think just, oh, the pill itself is patented. You don't think that everything involved in dispensing it and storing it and all of these things is also covered. Maybe you could talk about some of that stuff and the differences between a patent and a copyright when it comes to these kinds of laws. And then also, I want you to get into talking about this compulsory licenses, because that's a term that's being used a lot right now as some people are saying, oh, we can use compulsory licenses. We don't need a TRIPS waiver. Maybe you could talk about that and give us an understanding of what that even means, how it works, and if it's even applicable right now.
So one of the first things to know is that at that time I was describing with the fight over HIV/AIDS medications, antiretrovirals, typically those medicines had patents. So a patent is a monopoly protection granted by a government. It's like a license that protects an invention or a discovery, an idea effectively. So if you created some new medicine and it was what's called, it's original. It wasn't something someone already had done. You can get this government monopoly right. And a copyright protects original works of authorship. So like, for instance, the way to think about how this comes together is at the time of the antiretroviral WTO fight for HIV/AIDS, the medicines were basically protected by a patent. So at that time, the fight was to make clear you could get what was called a compulsory license. That is the ability for a government, if a company will not allow a contract for a local manufacturer, a monopoly patent holder, you can force a license. That's what a compulsory license is. You force a license. And the license is literally the right to make that thing that is under the patent monopoly. So let's just say I had the monopoly on come up with whatever it is, medicine, and you're in a different country, Ryan, and your country needs it. You would come to me and say, all right, company in country A, I would like this, or I may be in the same country. I would like to be able to make this medicine too. And I would say, well, I have a monopoly for 20 years. It's a patent. Go away. I can charge as much as I want. And if you could prove an overriding national interest, a health emergency, et cetera, then you could go to the government and say, hey, I've tried to get Wallach to give me this license. I'm happy to pay for it. She ain't budging. And then they force it. And they say, I will grant you, Company Ryan, a compulsory license to make Company Wallach's drug. And the WTO fight in the early 90s was just to make clear that their governments could do that, because the big pharma interests were saying, under these WTO rules, you can't even do that. So the situation, though, got kind of more evil. So the problem we have now is then there was a patent, and then you would do a compulsory license if a company was being greedy. Now the companies that are what are called the originators, so the companies that have made the product initially, in this instance with the vaccines, with literally tens of billions of taxpayer funds, but related but separate issue. So whoever has that intellectual property monopoly, now their strategy has been to make what is often called a thicket of intellectual property protections. So instead of there being a patent on the medicine, there is a patent on the medicine. But then there is also a patent on the 3 precursor chemicals that were created that go into the medicine. And then also the special whirligig that you created, which mixes up your components, gets patented. It's a machine and it's an invention, and that gets patented. And then you decide to make a special injector that is especially useful for this, and your medicine can only be the shot can only be through your injector, and that gets patented. And then in addition, your whirligig is operated by a computer program, and that gets copyrighted. And then also you have very specific rules about how the medicine can be transported and how it can be delivered and how it can be segmented and how it can be dosed. And that booklet gets copyrighted. And then in addition, you have a lot of know-how about the stuff that isn't just the recipe, that isn't just here's how the machine's engineering is done, that you try as these companies to get some kind of monopoly protection over as undisclosed information. You basically want to make it so it is basically nigh impossible for anyone to be able to make this but you. So you control how much, you control the prices. And these kind of IP thickets are what right now are like barbed wire around these vaccines. So that if these WTO rules that require all of these countries to have these rules in place and allow this kind of monopoly protection, it will make it almost impossible for what needs to happen, which is production needs to be scaled up all over the world of these vaccines, of these treatments, of these tests. Because it's not just we need to get everyone vaccinated once. It's going to be an ongoing process. And there is simply, there's no way under the current paradigm we are going to be able to get the volume, the supply. It's not even a money issue. A lot of the pushback from certain people in the US, government officials in the US or EU is, oh, look, we're starting to give to these different funds that will be buying the vaccines for poor countries. And, it's good luck. There's none to buy. That's part of the problem because the entire supply that exists is insufficient, and what is in existence has been already pre-ordered. So we have to have more made, which is why this WTO waiver covers the 4 different pieces of copyright, because the compulsory license for a patent ain't going to cut it. The thing that worked in the 1990s ain't going to cut it. You have to have, to the extent it limits the treatment and crushing of COVID, you have to have temporary suspension also of those copyright rules, as of course of the patent rules, of the non-disclosed information rules. You have to basically have the whole thicket. You have to have a very strong clipper to go through all that barbed wire and rip it out of the way so more production can happen.
How do these rules interact with our domestic laws and what happens to them at the World Trade Organization?
So that's a very big kettle of fish generally, and it's part of what is wrong with the WTO. But the short answer is the WTO has a requirement that is each country shall ensure the conformity of its domestic laws, regulations, and administrative procedures with the attached agreements. And that includes all those patent and copyright and other monopoly rules and TRIPS. So every country is obliged to have its domestic laws meet those rules. And if you don't, you can get hit with trade sanctions from another country. And also, frankly, without the blessing of the WTO to have the changes that many countries want to make. Countries want to be able to help support domestic production. Obviously, not every country can do it. But in every region of the world, there are companies in countries that could be making these vaccines and treatments and shipping it in the region. And there's just they're just endless stories of how having pharma monopoly control means no supply. There are just there's a very high-tech company in Bangladesh that's been begging all of the big pharma and Moderna and all the others to give them a license to be able to contract manufacture the medicine for distribution in Asia. The company that is currently having a contract with Johnson & Johnson in South Africa is obliged, because Johnson & Johnson totally controls it, to export 91% of what they make to Europe. 9% can be sold in South Africa. So the keeping that monopoly control in your domestic law, when governments want to have the blessing of the WTO in the short term to take the policy changes without threat of sanction, but also effectively like the good housekeeping seal of approval so that the pharma companies in other countries don't threaten them with lawsuits, etc., Because, the farmer can come into the domestic courts and say, this is a violation of your obligations under the... They just need all of that cleared away. And honestly, also, having the waiver is enormous leverage. Because there's been a lot of sweet talking of farmer, please do this, please contribute that, please share this. And none of it's happened. None of it's happened. And so this is the stick, right? This is the stick. This is if you guys don't start doing technology transfer, then we will use the rights under this WTO waiver to just do it on our own.
Rethinking Trade is produced by Public Citizens Global Trade Watch. To learn more, you can visit rethinktrade.org. You can also visit tradewatch.org. Stay tuned for more, and thank you for listening.